Hi, I'm going to talk to you all a bit about Chapter 20 and some general things that we should be looking at for the section dealing with Chapter 20 to about 24. Now, in the first several chapters that were assigned in this book, we looked at the process by which Europe became aware of the Americas, and by which Europe developed the naval technology that allowed it to travel effectively to Asia, or circumnavigate Africa, and to establish a regular contact and colonization with the Western Hemisphere. Now, once this happened, the dynamics between Eastern Eurasia, or Afro-Eurasia as the book says, and Western Afro-Eurasia began to change, especially with the discovery of the Americas. And for the Spanish in particular, their ability to exploit the massive reserves of silver in the Americas. Now, the primary thing that happened was that with the amount of specie, valuable metal, silver and gold, that the Spanish in particular were able to get, they were able to buy lots of valuable products from Asia. Now, the important thing to note, however, is that Europe still didn't produce anything that people in East Asia, people in China, people in India, people in China, people in Indonesia, or wanted. I mean, they basically had to buy everything with money. And so you don't really have trading. You basically have somebody coming in buying stuff. I mean, trading, it literally would mean that one side had goods that the other side wanted. And but both sides have goods that the other side wants. But in the case of Europe coming to, Asia at this time, from the 16th century onward, from the 16th century until the 18th century, put it that way, the only thing they had that people in East Asia wanted was money. Now, but the thing that they did have, however, was rapidly improving naval technology. The ships became better, faster, more agile, and a rapidly improving military technology. Now, gun technology was actually invented in China, as you all have read already. But people in the West were actively improving it and were becoming more effective with it. And so basically between the enhanced naval ability and between the money that they were getting from contact with the Americas, European powers, beginning with the Portuguese and then later the French, the British, and the Dutch, they were developing the ability to impact trade. They weren't able to completely take over trade, but they were able to insert themselves as carriers of goods from one port to another. And also what we see too is that they were able to establish control over areas of Asia. The Dutch were able to get control in what nowadays is Indonesia. The British and the French were able to get control of different parts of what nowadays would be, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, or South Asia. And the Portuguese, for a time, controlled the coast of East Africa. The Portuguese were able to control Goa, an island off the coast of India. The Portuguese were able to get control of Macau, which is off the coast of China. And so the Europeans were able to establish strongholds in Asia, but by no means were they able to take over Asia. They did not anywhere have the ability to take on China in particular. India was a slightly different case because India did not have, an effective unified government. However, once you get into chapter 20, the significant thing here is that all of this expenditure on ships, all of this expenditure on naval expenses, and also the increased competition for power in Europe itself became a very expensive thing. Because remember, at the end of the day, Europe had a trade deficit with Asia. And so they used the money, they could use this money that they were getting from the Americas, and because also I need to mention too, it's very important that, as we get into the 17th and the 18th century, sugar in particular becomes an incredibly valuable commodity that's produced in the Americas, produced in Brazil, produced in the Caribbean, produced in certain parts of North America, in modern day Louisiana, becomes, one of the most valuable, becomes the most valuable product produced in the Americas. I mean, eventually sugar becomes more valuable than the silver that was coming out of South America and Mexico. And that money was something that was able to fuel military development because, for instance, the king of the Habsburg Empire was also king of Spain, King Philip. And he was using that money in order to finance wars and to get control of more territory in Europe. And so what we see is that the money coming from the Americas, it was giving European powers more military capability, but that increased capability meant that they were actually fighting each other too. And really, one of the important things I want you all to understand is that Europe doesn't really begin to undermine Asian economic ability until you get to the Industrial Revolution. Now, and we're going to talk about the lecture after this one. Once you get into the latter part of the 18th century, and you see the development of mechanized production, in particular mechanized textile production, and also the mechanized production of porcelain goods, that gives the Europeans an advantage over Asia. They're able to, instead of constantly buying textiles from India, European powers are then able to get raw material and produce goods themselves. Instead of buying fine porcelain from China, it's becoming manufactured in first in Britain and in other places. But before we get to that, we need to look at some of the political instability that comes out of the various rivalries for control of different colonial territories. Now, in particular, the book starts off looking at the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was a conflict, and in the Americas, it's traditionally referred to as the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763. Now, this was a conflict between, at the heart of it, it was a conflict between Spain and between France. Excuse me, did I say Spain and France? Excuse me, I meant to say Britain and France. Please, not Spain and France, Britain and France. That's a mistake on my part. It was a conflict between Britain and France. France was the biggest country in Western Europe, had the biggest population, very powerful militarily on land. Britain, however, had far and away the biggest navy and had a bigger economic footprint overseas than France. And so the 7 Years' War basically is a war at the heart of it in which Britain and France are fighting for control of North America. Like, for instance, we're over here in Southwest Illinois. I mean, this is the territory which a little bit after the period we're talking about became known as the Northwest Territories. And, over here in Southwest Illinois, this is some of the territory that the British and the French were fighting over. Now, in addition to fighting over control of the Mississippi River Valley and other areas that would, the Ohio River, all these, and later the Missouri River, all these areas that drained into the Gulf of Mexico, from the Great Lakes and other areas, they were also fighting for control of territory in India, because, as the book mentions, the British East India Company was beginning to establish itself as a significant military and political player during the 18th century. Well, the bottom line is that the British were successful in defeating the French and getting a much bigger foothold in North America and becoming the dominant players in South Asia by 1763. However, that was not the end of the story. As we all know, within 13 years of the ending of the 7 Years' War, the colonies in what nowadays are the United States break away from Britain and begin to fight for their independence, which they were able to eventually achieve by 1783. We also see that in France itself, you have the breakout of the French Revolution and the French monarchy. In this case, the Bourbon monarchy, which had gone back several hundred years. I mean, for instance, if you look here, across the river from where we are in St. Louis, King Louis the Ninth, it was an early Bourbon monarch. So, this was a royal family that goes back a very long ways. But they would eventually be overthrown within 30 years of losing the 7 Years' War. And then also, by 1804, Haiti would become the only country in modern history in which African plantation slaves permanently remove the master class of their country and achieve independence. And so there are really massive political upheavals that come out of that have roots in the economic dislocation that's talked about in the beginning of chapter 20. Now, ideologically, the ideas for independence, the ideas for more participatory government go back to the 17th century. People like Locke, Montesquieu, these political philosophers that put out ideas about representative government and rights for individuals going back 2 or 3 generations before you actually have the revolutions. And so the legitimacy of monarchy was really being undermined. Now, the other thing that's really significant is that the notion of equality, the notion of more representative government, made at least some people question the system by which Europe was gaining money. Because in the Americas in particular, really at the heart of the economic engine that was allowing for military expansion, that would eventually allow for the development of industrial technology, was slavery. And, that really goes back to the film that I assigned you all last week that looks at the impact of slavery on Africa. Because, you have a situation in which Europe is developing, and conversely, Africa is being underdeveloped. Because Africa is losing people, is losing money, is losing ideas, which weakens it. That's why the West grows most effectively. Asia grows. But Africa is the one major center of world population during this period from the 16th century until the early 19th century that actually undergoes either a loss of population or at least a stasis, in which you don't have a significant growth in population. And so that's why it's really significant that one of the things that comes out of this period of revolution, and we'll talk about it more later, is people begin to really question slavery. Slaves themselves, in the case of Haiti, these people who fight and gain their independence and keep it permanently, because there have been other independence movements. I mean, like for instance, you've already seen in your readings where they talk about Palmares in Brazil, in which Africans are able to get their independence for about 80 years. We don't really see it so much in this book, but north of Brazil, in what nowadays is Suriname, French Guiana, and British Guiana, Africans were able to escape and go deep into the jungles and the river systems and establish maroon communities that kept their independence. Even on small islands like Jamaica, in the central part of Jamaica, you had communities that escaped from slavery and maintained their freedom. But in Haiti, you actually have a whole country that maintains its independence. Now, as I said before, these changes are very dramatic, and they, like the economic changes that we've talked about already, they have long-term consequences. In North America, where the 13 colonies get their independence, they become the United States. And even though you have people who have problems with slavery, these people are both pragmatists, and we also have to be honest that there's a significant element of racism in which these people are not comfortable with the idea of slaves gaining their freedom, and especially of slaves having anything approaching equality. And so we see the slave system being maintained. In South America, in Latin America, you have a different dynamic in which you have a lot of different countries. Most of these countries, the biggest population group are people of indigenous ancestry, although you do have significant populations of people of African descent in certain parts of Spanish-speaking Latin America, like Ecuador, the Caribbean coast of South America, a number, and especially on the islands of the Caribbean, you have a significant African population. But in South America itself, the territory of the largest African population is not Spanish controlled; it's Portuguese controlled, and that's Brazil. But what we see is that because, and really this boils down to the colonial styles of the Spanish as opposed to the British. Now, the British for about 150-year period really had kind of a laissez-faire or let alone attitude towards American colonists, and did not, let them pretty much govern themselves. Now, once the 7 Years' War was over and Britain had spent a lot of money, the British government, led by King George, decided that they would have to have tighter control over the colonies to get more money. And ultimately, that was what triggered the war for independence as much as any ideas about freedom. It was the fact that, people who had been independent for several generations now all of a sudden found themselves being dominated by the British government, and they ended up revolting. But the point to be made is that this economic dislocation and economic competition would result in significant political fallout, and you would eventually end up with several new different political systems. Now, as for the Spanish system, the Spanish had never developed a tradition of allowing significant local control for colonial people. And they also maintained a thoroughgoing, racial hierarchy. I mean, America had a racial hierarchy, but basically people, the colonial population of white settlers was much larger in what became America than in Spanish America. And since they had more power, once they fought for independence, it was easier for them to consolidate power and develop an effective government. What we see in Latin America is that since colonized people did not have access to power, and since the population was very fragmented sharply along racial lines, once independence came, these people were not really able to get together and establish strong countries. And so that is very much at the root of why you have a very powerful United States. And in Latin America, you've always had a number of smaller countries that were never able to coalesce and have the kind of power that really would allow them to rival the United States. Now, Haiti, on the other hand, is in the third category, because once Haiti is able to get its independence, because it is a country that is controlled by former slaves, all of their neighbors are scared to death of it. They are scared to death that if, quote unquote, their slaves had contact with the Haitians, they would get ideas and overthrow the slave systems in their countries. And so the result for Haiti is that although Haiti gains its independence, Haiti is ostracized. Haiti is the only country I've ever known of that won a war and end up having to pay reparations to the country that it defeated. The Haitians had to pay the French money, for many generations because the French lost their quote-unquote property in Haiti. And then other countries like the United States would not recognize Haiti for the first 58 or so years of its independence because slavery was still a thing in America. And the American government did not want to recognize a country that was ruled by people who had destroyed the system of slavery. And so Haiti ends up being an outcast country and becomes a very poor country. And to this day, Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere because it still deals with a degree of ostracism that has its roots in the way it was founded. Now, once we get into the next chapter and we start looking more at economic things, we're going to see how these new political systems, how they eventually settle down. And in the case of the Americas and in the case of England and some other countries, really gives people a way to feel more a part of the society. In particular, like if you look in the section in chapter 20 that talks about the French Revolution, the major innovation that comes out of that revolution really for political life is the fact that you see the development of a modern sense of nationalism being developed in France, where the French citizens see the government and see the country as belonging to them. They feel that they are loyal to the country itself, not so much their religion, not so much their region, but they feel that they are loyal to the country. And they develop the sense of patriotism. And as the book mentions, France ends up conquering a lot of Europe before it is eventually defeated and forced back into its territories. But the notion of nationalism and patriotism spreads from France and goes throughout Europe. And nationalism is still a very important idea. In in Western political thought and in world political thought to this day. And so from that standpoint, these political movements that we're talking about in chapter 20 are things that still resonate with the world that we're in now. Anyway, I hope this lecture was helpful to you.